Hello, I'm Dominic Sandbrook. I'm a historian. I've written several books on post-war Britain, the most recent of which is Seasons in the Sun. I loved doing the TV series that went along with the book. It was something that I hadn't done before, and I was quite nervous about it, and I thought, will it be terribly boring and cold standing around on location? But the great thing about it is that when you're a writer, you work on your own. I don't have research assistants or anything like that, so it's quite a solitary life. And when you're working with a TV crew, there's a great camaraderie. You're bringing your project to the screen, and you're obviously going to show it to more people than will ever read one of your books.
Yeah, tragically, yeah.
It is a tragedy, but I think the great thing about TV is that you're able to bring history alive with a kind of immediacy that sucks people in who wouldn't necessarily buy history books. And if only 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 people who watch the series are even tempted to buy a book, I think that's a job well done.
Yeah.
The funny thing about the 70s is that most people were probably better off than they had been in the 50s and 60s. So life was better. People had washing machines and fridges and TVs. They went on foreign holidays. They lived longer. Their health was better. They were better housed and so on. And yet I think there was this kind of pervasive dissatisfaction and gloom about, if you like, the fortunes of Great Britain Limited. So people thought, I'm better off than ever, but actually I think the country's going to the dogs. And that's very widespread in the 70s, this sense that somehow things haven't worked out, they've failed, and that they'll continue failing. There was a sort of, if you look at opinion polls, there's enormous pessimism about what will happen next year economically. And that was something unusual because, of course, in the 50s and 60s, there was this great optimism about how things were going. So that's what I think makes the 70s distinctive, that kind of pervasive air of kind of dissatisfaction and disappointment and gloom and almost a kind of endemic seediness that was sort of seeping into all aspects of life. I think Britain did feel different in 79 than it had felt in 69. And I think the reason is that it had undergone, it's like a sort of a battered spouse or something, it's undergone this sort of beating after beating. If you think of the 3-day week, having to go to the IMF for a bailout, the winter of discontent and so on, national morale was just a little bit bruised, really. I think people felt that, some of these problems were going to be almost impossible to resolve, that economically our best days might not be ahead of us after all. And I think in 1969, when people talked about the 1970s, they were quite excited. They thought, we'll be getting a hovercraft to the moon and all this kind of thing.
Tomorrow's world thing.
There is this kind of tomorrow's world element. But in 1979, I think when people look forward, it's, the 70s have been pretty bleak. Let's cross our fingers and hope the 80s are better. And of course, for some people, the interesting thing about the 80s is, for some people, they were better, and for some people, they're an awful lot worse. Well, Labour were in power constantly from 74 to 79, but I think it falls definitely into two periods. So you have Wilson, first of all, Harold Wilson, who'd been Prime Minister before in the 60s, and then you have Jim Callaghan coming in 1976. And I think of the two, Wilson is better known today, but was less effective. Wilson was a bit of a busted flush, really, when he came back in 74. He was knackered, he was worn out, he was a little bit paranoid, quite honestly. A lot of the time in Downing Street was spent with infighting and feuding and bickering and so on. And basically a lot of decisions got postponed or not taken at all, economically particularly. So, inflation went to 26%. And a lot of Wilson's aides were really frustrated. He's not doing anything. We're just sitting around arguing rather than actually governing. And then Callaghan came in 76, and actually Callaghan gets a worse press than he deserves because I think he was a much more effective Prime Minister than Harold Wilson. Wilson was cleverer, but Callaghan was tougher. And Callaghan was a good manager of people. The public liked him a lot. He had the best ratings of any Prime Minister since Harold Macmillan. His ratings were actually better than Margaret Thatcher's. And Callaghan wasn't, he really wasn't bad. The first thing that happened to him was the IMF crisis when we had to go for the bailout. And that wasn't really his fault. It was something he'd inherited from Wilson, a sort of terrible sterling position. But he handled it pretty well. And all seemed to be going well for Callaghan until the end of 1978 when he could have called an election and he didn't. And then the winter of discontent happened and he was just blown away. He was unable to deal with it because, of course, he'd been loyal to the unions all his life. And, now history writes him off as a bit of a loser, which I think is unfair, when in many ways he was a much more effective Prime Minister than Wilson was. Well, my favourite 70s politician is definitely Dennis Healey. He was Labour Chancellor from 1974 to 1979, and I think it's fair to say that even Healey himself admits that when he started he made a dreadful Horlicks of it, and his first budgets were a bit of a disaster. He put up tax, top rate of income tax to 83%, and he was perceived as a very political chancellor, but very unusually politicians. He got better as he went on. He learned on the job. He started to take some really tough decisions, very unpopular decisions with a lot of the Labour Party to try and get spending under control and cut the debt and so on. And I think he was also, what I really like about Dennis Healey is that he's an old school politician. He's somebody who, he's a very cultured, cultivated man. He reads poetry in his spare time, listens to classical music, all this kind of thing. He's not a career politician that we have today. But he's also got this kind of populist side to him. He's a bit of a bruiser. He likes a drink and a sing-song. So he's a really sort of intriguing, colourful, clever, outgoing character. And of course, the 70s, it's seen as this decade of political failure, but there were lots of great politicians. Think of somebody like Michael Foot, or you've got Ted Heath, Enoch Powell, Callaghan, Anthony Crosland. They're all, Barbara Castle, Margaret Thatcher. They're all kind of larger than life characters. They're all great characters, and they're all people with this dreaded word. They've all got hinterlands. They've all got all these interests and outside politics. And the great shame today is that they're all basically the same. I think the politician who I would have to admit emerges least well from my books is probably Tony Benn. And that's not really because of his politics, it's because of, I just think he was fundamentally disloyal to his colleagues. It's very striking, the number of times in the diaries when you go through them, he's either plotting against them, or he's moaning and threatening to resign and all this kind of thing. But the thing about him is he never does resign. So, if he did resign, you would have a lot of respect for him. You'd say he's walked out on, to fight for his principles. But mysteriously, he always seems to find that it would be better to stay in the cabinet and to fight from the nice, polished ministerial bench rather than the backbenches. And I just think that, there's a sort of element of, dare I say, self-righteousness in Benn, that perhaps there isn't in some of his, Labour colleagues. The Callahans and the Healeys and whatnot, they were rolling up their sleeves and getting stuck in and making themselves unpopular, but taking the decisions they thought were necessary. I think Tony Benn had this tendency in the 70s to tell his audience what they wanted to hear, rather than basically, as a lot of his colleagues would say to him, Tony, you're not facing up to the challenges of the day. And to me, he doesn't emerge, terribly well from that story. And it's amazing that he's morphed into this great folk hero.
Yeah, exactly.
When in many ways, he's not a colleague that you would necessarily want sitting behind you. Well, I've just started work on a new book on the first part of the 80s, so I'm just keeping the series going. It's going very well. I've been thinking a lot about the Falklands War and about the creation of Next, and the first home computers.
First Waterstones as well.
The birth of Waterstones, of course, one of the seismic events of the 1980s.
Indeed, yeah. Most important.
Brideshead Revisited. There's a lot of fun you can have with sort of 80s culture and society, but I think it's such a rich, interesting, conflicted time that I'm having a lot of fun with it, and I can't wait to finish the book. I think a good bookshop has a kind of a warmth, and it has a sort of sense of welcome and hospitality. So you feel it's a little bit like walking into your own personal library. But I think the great thing about a bookshop is that it surprises you, that there are things there you didn't expect to see and you didn't know existed. Today, when you're shopping online, you often buy books that, you go deliberately online to buy a book. But I think the beauty of a bookshop is you're going to look for Dominic Sandbrook or Jeffrey Archer or whatever it might be. Not that I'm bracketing those two authors. But then your eye is caught by something else and you think, oh, I never heard of this. I think that's the great thing about a bookshop, that you discover all these gems that you never knew were there. You fall in love with all these authors that you never knew existed. That's what a bookshop can give you that just online shopping never can.